I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
For more than 200 years, religious orders run mission schools for Indigenous children, the precursors to the Government of Canada's residential school system. The Mohawk Institute becomes a boarding school. Run by the Anglican Church, it is the first government-funded residential school in Canada. A government report recommends Indigenous children be separated from their parents in order to assimilate them into Western culture. These recommendations influence federal laws and policies designed to strip Indigenous people of their culture and rights. Isle-Lacrosse opens in northern Saskatchewan. The majority of students are Métis. The government takes authority over Indigenous people and education for First Nations. The Indian Act gives the Canadian government control over Indigenous rights and culture. The Act includes only First Nations as status Indians. It excludes Métis and Inuit. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of the residential school system, which is designed to isolate Indigenous children from their families and cut all ties to their cultures. The number of schools across Canada quickly climbs to over 40. The Government of Canada requires First Nations children aged 7 to 16 to attend residential school. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce exposes the government's neglect of Indigenous children's health, including alarmingly high death rates of residential school students. More than 80 institutions are in operation across Canada, the most at any one time. 4 students are investigated for arson. Others reportedly cheer as they watch the school burn. This is one of dozens of fires set by students across Canada as a form of resistance. Inuit children are officially included in the residential school system. 6 schools open in the Western Arctic as the government takes over the administration of many church-run residential schools. Grolier Hall and Stringer Hall open in Inuvik, housing 500 students. More than 20,000 Indigenous children are taken from their families by government social workers and placed in foster care or adoption homes, often with non-Indigenous families. Adoptees lose connection with their Indigenous language, culture, and identity. 12-year-old Chani Wendak dies after escaping from the Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School. A formal investigation follows. The all-white jury finds that residential schools cause tremendous emotional and psychological problems. The Canadian government takes over responsibility for the remaining schools from the churches. Thousands of Indigenous students are enrolled at the 28 residential schools that are still running in Canada. Phil Fontaine, head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, speaks publicly of the abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Indian Residential School. He calls for a public inquiry, which the federal government initiates in 1991. Gordon's Residential School is the last federally run school to close. The report recommends a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools, including language loss and trauma.
They were punished when they tried to speak their language or practice their culture. More than 4,000 children died. Those that survived came out of the school system different people.
It took me away from how I was brought up and how my mother and my father had a role in my life and how they created the opportunity to be with them and to be a part of their lives.
Their families were separated to break down the family bond.
My mother went to residential school and I went to residential school, and it was when I was 6 years old until I was 13 years old. And I wanted to see them so much, but I could never really get to see them because we were separated. I started to lose the language. My father was a fluent Cree speaker. And when I came out, I could say a few words, but I could never speak fluently to him. And that was hard because my father was a very loving, caring, and I found it so hard.
Both Francis and Patrick Sr. lived through some hard years. For Francis, the healing began at a women's shelter.
And I could open up and just finally let out my feelings about what happened to me. And I cried, and then that's when I could feel my spirit come back to me. And then I could be there for my kids. I went to get them and I took them with me into shelter. And that's where my healing began.
We have to stay focused and explain not just the pain is part of it, yes, but what was there before the disruption of a human being away from themselves, to educate them in regards to not to point a finger at them, but to have that communication that yes, the truth is the truth, but we need to create that atmosphere towards reconciliation.
Patrick Jr. walks with his dad to show support.
I understand why we are the way we are, why we're so angry. And, I'm done being angry now. Hopefully we all get there.
Francis believes it's important that we never forget the abuse Aboriginal children suffered in residential schools.
I think it should be taught in the schools so that everybody could understand what we went through, so that we can go back to our ways and the way we were supposed to be, our traditions and our values. We need to be who we are.
I was 14 and a half when I was sterilized, but I didn't know at the time that's what was happening.
When I was put in the institution, my mother threw me out of the car like a piece of garbage she didn't want. And that's how I became a trainee at the institution. I wish I could get a hold of the people that did all this crap to all the kids in there, myself and everyone else. They don't realize the damage that they did to a lot of people and the hurt and the shame that we carried all our lives.
They told me they were taking my appendix out. Well, I never asked questions. Back then I just did everything I was told. I never ever asked anybody questions. I didn't know anything about the sterilization because we were told they were taking our appendix out. Well, they did that, but they also sterilized us. And I didn't find out till I was in my 20s that I was sterilized. I was about 20, close to 24, I believe it was. I went to the U of A hospital and I saw Dr. Goodwin there. I told him I wanted to have children and I was having trouble, and they asked me what the scar was on my stomach. And he says, they don't remove your appendix from the stomach. I said, well, that's funny. They told me they did. And they did a test, and there was no tube there. There was about 1/4 of an inch of one tube on the left side. They had removed everything. The eugenics board had to give approval. 5 minutes in their office, and we were out of there. It took 5 minutes for them to decide to wreck our lives. And I don't even know why they met with us, because they already had their minds made up. It was already stamped and cleared. We were human beings. We weren't cattle. Like, they were literally just like on a conveyor belt, throwing us through. They had their own medical building, which was built the same year I was put in there, in '55. It was called the Medical Clinic. I think it was in 1980 when I finally accepted the fact that I was sterilized and nothing could be done to repair it. When I finally realized and would accept it is when my adoption fell through. There was a young girl that was pregnant, and she knew my husband and I, and she wanted us to have her baby. This young girl picked David and I out of 3 other couples. So I bought everything. When he was at sea, I spent money like nobody spent money. I had everything, bassinet, cribs, just 12 dozen diapers, cloth diapers, because I don't like disposable. I had everything. And she came, when David just got home from sea, the social worker came to our door. She said, your adoption has fallen through. My husband then, at that time, didn't even wait to listen to anything else. He just took off. So I asked her after he had gone, why? Because we were chosen by this young girl. And if she didn't know us, she wouldn't have given us that chance to have a baby. And she said, we just went through all your files that you had given us, that you had a mark against you. You were in an institution. You were in the files, in the papers there. You would not be a fit mother. And I'm thinking, I don't usually swear, but I'm going to say it, you bitch. You don't know me. And you come and you hurt me like this. After she left the house, I took everything I bought. There was about a few $1,000s worth of stuff that I had bought for the baby.
I took it outside, put it in a burn barrel, and burned it all. Smashed everything. I can say I fully recovered to the extent that I've gone on with my life. I haven't dwelled on it to bring me down. You can't escape it. It's there for life. You get in the shower, you get under a skid, you know, it's there forever. So it's a constant reminder, but I don't dwell on it. I literally just, you know, I go on with life and try and be as happy as I can and do things. I play poker with the ladies, and you can't let this stuff drag you down. Otherwise, I'd be back in another place. And I won't let anybody knock me down anymore. I think it is great that this story is being kept alive through other people, through young people, because they can stop this from happening again if they stay involved.
The colleges opened up the admissions process, and suddenly there were people of different religions and no religion. There were people of different races. So suddenly you had coeducation, all of these different students who were probably not living together in the neighborhoods where they grew up, which were much more segregated, who were suddenly living together on the same campus. Campus administrators made an assumption, fatal assumption, that without adequate supervision by adult bureaucrats, student life bureaucrats, these students would kill each other. And so they immediately ramped up the student life bureaucrats, and you know what bureaucrats love to do, they write rules, and suddenly the campuses were less free than they ever were. That was the fatal mistake. Why? Because students actually get along fairly well if left alone. I mean, I've seen it, I've dealt with students my entire legal career. They do get along. But when you've got bureaucrats who operate on the assumption that they're prepared to kill each other, and that sort of permeates everybody's thinking on the campus. And suddenly you have all these rules to keep students from assaulting each other, from embarrassing each other, from talking in an upsetting fashion to each other.
There are 3 types of microaggressions: micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations.
This is on liberal arts campuses where you're supposed to talk in an upsetting fashion because you're trying to say things honestly rather than always sugarcoating them, right? That's the nature of, these are liberal arts institutions, searching for the truth. You had this bureaucracy working counter to the ethos of the liberal arts institution. Suddenly, on a college campus, you couldn't say something that upset somebody. Literally, this was written into a code. And if you said something upsetting, the student can complain about it, and you were suddenly charged. The bureaucracy has a life of its own, operates on a trajectory of its own. It's got a culture that is inimical to the whole concept of higher education, academic freedom, due process and fairness. They don't understand any of this, much less have any fidelity to it. What it means is that the preservation of liberty is a constant struggle. What's new about that? Absolutely nothing.
So I'm similar to a gadfly. A gadfly is a little bug that gets under your skin and irritates you. So I've always tried to irritate people. I've been very, very controversial in my lifetime, and I enjoyed being a gadfly. I made folks very, very uncomfortable when I created the bitch test. They said, "Oh God, what is the bitch test? Why don't you call it something else?" I said, "Well, testing is a bitch." And then I created a firestorm of controversy when I introduced the term, coined the term Ebonics. Right here in Oakland, California, was the cause of that controversy when they said that Ebonics was a legitimate language. So I've had several epiphanies in my lifetime. As I told the group the other day, the first epiphany came when I was sitting on the toilet seat, and the idea for the bitch test just come down on me like that. Huh? You know, epiphanies occur at very odd times. I mean, it's not when you're giving a lecture like that. I mean, it's when you're doing something, you know, unusual. So I've had several epiphanies. One of the things that Dr. Bobby Wright, who was one of my heroes, wrote, we should study white folks. And I hadn't thought about that. You know, they studied us. Said we had black talk, black English, deficient language, welfare mothers, druggies, and all of those bad things. So I said, well, look, I'm going to look into their psyche. So I asked their children, what did your mamas and your daddies say about you, say about black folks? And they told me some amazing stories. And that's how racism gets started, right in the family. And I wrote this little book called Racism, Learn at an Early Age Through Racial Scripting. And it tells how these kids were racially scripted to hate us. And they're still doing it. About 70% of the kids told me that they had negative racial scripts. So I asked the question, is racism learned or is it inherited? Racism is learned. No child is born with racism, with a racist mind or racist attitude. Just as a song from South Pacific says, you've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed into your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, of people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6, 7, or 8. To hate all the people your relatives hate, you've got to be carefully taught. And with that thought, I said, well, look, white folks learn racism from their mothers and fathers. Parents, relatives, teachers, friends, the media, and religious organizations all teach these racist stereotypes and myths. Consequently, racism is socialized into the system, and that's what we have to look at, the psyche of the white person. I watched the Phil Donahue show back in the 90s, and they had some racists on the air, and they asked this one woman, said, if your child was ill and needed transfusion, would you permit black blood? She said, no, I wouldn't let my child be transfused with black blood. I would rather let my child die. You know, that's very sad, very, very sad. So what is taught? Racial scripts. Racial scripts are really a series of program messages that parents teach to their children, that the media teach. And secondly, society has created all of these racial myths about us. They portrayed blacks as welfare mothers, thugs, uneducated, happy-go-lucky, no ambitions, dancing fools. Well, we do like to dance, but criminals. And I guess we're going to be dancing tomorrow night, too. But, you know, the point is, and as Naeem has said, and as Azebo, who was one of my former students, has said, that we have been misoriented, and we must become reoriented. Here's one of the ways that we've been misoriented people. We let our kids develop what I call the jockstrap mentality. You know what that is? Want to become athletes. We've got to develop people like you, too, who want to become scholars. Too many of our boys want to become athletes. But we've got to become models for these kids to say that there are other opportunities in the world other than become a Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or an Earl Campbell. Develop powerful verbal skills. You know, I spoke Ebonics until it was in college. And Dr. Harriet Pipes McAdoo's father heard me give a talk one day and said, I want you to take my advanced composition class because you have a problem. And Dr. Pipes took me into his class, and he taught me how to conjugate a verb. And he taught me all about adjectives and adverbs, things I'd never heard about. And then he said, take a course in French, and you'll learn how to conjugate verbs. And I did. But we have to risk sometimes losing our job. I remember when I was at Washington University, one of the things that I was, you know, the kids, they really said, Dr. Wade, let's you and them fight. That's what they would put me out there. I chose to be my own captain.
Right. You quote H.L. Mencken, whom you call a prominent intellectual during the Progressive Era. Quote, it is apparent that the Negro, no matter how much he is educated, must remain, as a race, in a condition of subservience, that he must remain the inferior. Therefore, the effort to educate him has awakened in his mind ambitions and aspirations which, in the very nature of things, must go unrealized. Close quote. It's that phrase, in the very nature of things, that gets to the view.
Yes, that was a pervasive view during that era.
And it is straightforward, pure racism, in the strict sense of believing that the races are materially different from one another.
Yes. One of the problems with this way of thinking is that it eternalizes a set of circumstances that exist at the moment. And when you realize how even a whole century is just a blink of an eye in the history of the human race, and when you realize, for example, that IQ tests have only existed for about a century and are by no means infallible, if you look back over the centuries and you see how the races that were on top at one time were now no longer on top. I mean, at one time, the Middle East was the leading civilization in the world. And before them, China, for even more centuries, was the leading civilization of the world. And even within Europe, it was precisely the Southern Europeans who were so much more advanced than the people in Britain or Scandinavia. What the people of that era did was take the different achievements of different groups and sort of freeze them in stone as if there was no past and there would be no future.
You also note that certain cultural groups scored especially low on abstract reasoning. It's not just African Americans. It's also Gaelic speakers in the Scottish Hebrides. It's Indians in South Africa. It's working class children in rural England. It's lower class youngsters in Venezuela. It's a particular culture that is perhaps too poor to have the time, as it were, or the intellectual resources to devote to abstract reasoning.
I would look at it somewhat differently.
You would?
I would say that very often we try to explain, for example, why the Irish didn't do as well as the English. And the real question is, well, the real fact is that the Irish were much more typical of people around the world than were the English. And the real question is, why did the English do so much better?
Why was there an industrial revolution on one island and not on the other?
That's right. And I think the same thing here, that if you go far enough back in history, I suspect you'll find that most of the human race had no interest in abstractions. And so the question becomes, certain kinds of cultures do have a desire for get into abstractions, and that becomes an enormous advantage to them. But I wouldn't try to explain why the others didn't do it, because the others were unfortunately what the majority of people are like in the world, even today. So you see the very same pattern, and all the things that are supposed to explain that pattern and explain it away among blacks are found among people who have none of those same factors. But what's the same in both places is that the intellectuals have told them that the world is unjust, that other people are keeping them down, that the fact that they don't have what other people have is somebody else's fault. And if you buy that vision, then of course there's no reason for you to do well in school. And you resent those who do well because they've bought into the enemy's way of thinking.
Well, Jensen and his critics seem to me to operate from a premise that there needs to be some unique explanation of the black IQ. And one finds it in environment, one finds it in heredity. What I tried to look at was whether that uniqueness was there in the first place, whether the level of the black IQ or the pattern of the black IQ was significantly different from that of any number of other ethnic groups in the past at a similar stage of their development. What I found was that there was not. Moreover, what I found was that as these various groups began to rise socioeconomically, their IQs also began to rise. One of the most striking things to me was that as of World War I, Jewish soldiers scored well below the national average on mental tests in the Army. Within a decade or so, that had all changed. So that it seemed to me to indicate that these IQ levels are not something that are written in stone, even for a large group, and that as other kinds of developments go on, you expect these kinds of developments also.
Indeed, if you score the people a century ago against modern norms, they would have an average IQ of 70. If you score us against their norms, we would have an average IQ of 130. Now, this has raised all sorts of questions. Were our immediate ancestors on the verge of mental retardation? Because 70 is normally the score for mental retardation. Or are we on the verge of all being gifted? Because 130 is the cutting line for giftedness. Now, I'm going to try and argue for a third alternative that's much more illuminating than either of those. And to put this into perspective, let's imagine that a Martian came down to Earth and found a ruined civilization. And this Martian was an archaeologist, and they found scores, target scores, that people had used for shooting. And first they looked at 1865, and they found that in a minute, people had only put one bullet in the bullseye. And then they found in 1898 that they'd put about 5 bullets in the bullseye in a minute. And then about 1918, they'd put 100 bullets in the bullseye. And initially, that archaeologist would be baffled. They would say, look, these tests were designed to find out how much people were steady of hand, how keen their eyesight was, whether they had control of their weapon. How could these performances have escalated to this enormous degree? Well, we now know, of course, the answer. If that Martian looked at battlefields, they would find that people had only muskets at the time of the Civil War, and that they had repeating rifles at the time of the Spanish-American War, and then they had machine guns by the time of World War I. And in other words, it was the equipment that was in the hands of the average soldier that was responsible, not greater keenness of eye or steadiness of hand. Now, what we have to imagine is the mental artillery that we have picked up over those 100 years. And I think, again, that another thinker will help us here, and that's Luria. Luria looked at people just before they entered the scientific age, and he found that these people were resistant to classifying the concrete world. They wanted to break it up into little bits that they could use. he found that they were resistant to deducing the hypothetical, to speculating about what might be. And he found finally that they didn't deal well with abstractions or using logic on those abstractions. Now let me give you a sample of some of his interviews. He talked to the head man of a person in rural Russia. They'd only had, as people had in 1900, about 4 years of schooling. And he asked that particular person, what do crows and fish have in common? And the fellow said, absolutely nothing. You know, I can eat a fish, I can't eat a crow. A crow can peck at a fish can't do anything to a crow. And the Luria said, but aren't they both animals? And he said, of course not. One's a fish, you know, the other is a bird. And he was interested effectively in what he could do with those concrete objects. And then Luria went to another person, and he said to them, there are no camels in Germany. Hamburg is a city in Germany. Are there camels in Hamburg? And the fellow said, well, if it's large enough, there ought to be camels there. And Luria said, but what do my words imply? And he said, well, maybe it's a small village and there's no room for camels. In other words, he was unwilling to treat this as anything but a concrete problem. And he was used to camels being in villages, and he was quite unable to use the hypothetical, to ask himself, what if there were no camels in Germany? A third interview was conducted with someone about the North Pole. And Luria said, at the North Pole there is always snow. Wherever there is always snow, the bears are white. What color are the bears at the North Pole? And the response was, such a thing is to be settled by testimony. If a wise person came from the North Pole and told me the bears were white, I might believe him. But every bear that I've seen is a brown bear. Now you see again, this person has rejected going beyond the concrete world and analyzing it through everyday experience, and it was important to that person what color bears were. That is, they had to hunt bears. They weren't willing to engage in this. One of them said to Luria, how can we solve things that aren't real problems? None of these problems are real. How can we address them? Now, these three categories, classification, using logic on abstractions, taking the hypothetical seriously, how much difference do they make in the real world beyond the testing room? And let me give you a few illustrations. First, almost all of us today get a high school diploma. That is, we've gone from 4 to 8 years of education to 12 years of formal education, and 52% of Americans have actually experienced some type of tertiary education. Now, not only do we have much more education, and much of that education is scientific, and you can't do science without classifying the world. You can't do science without proposing hypotheses. You can't do science without making it logically consistent. And even down in grade school, things have changed. In 1910, they looked at the examinations that the state of Ohio gave to 14-year-olds, and they found that they were all for socially valued concrete information. They were things like, what are the capitals of the 44 or 5 states that existed at that time? When they looked at the exams that the state of Ohio gave in 1990, they were all about abstractions. They were things like, why is the largest city of a state rarely the capital? And you were supposed to think, well, the state legislature was rural controlled, and they hated the big city, so rather than putting the capital in a big city, they put it in a county seat. They put it in Albany rather than New York. They put it in Harrisburg rather than Philadelphia, and so forth. So the tenor of education has changed. We're educating people to take the hypothetical seriously, to use abstractions, and to link them logically. What about employment? Well, in 1900, 3% of Americans practiced professions that were cognitively demanding. Only 3% were lawyers or doctors or teachers. Today, 35% of Americans practice cognitively demanding professions. Not only the professions proper, like lawyer or doctor or scientist or lecturer, but many, many sub-professions having to do with being a technician, a computer programmer, a whole range of professions now make cognitive demands. And we can only meet the terms of employment in the modern world by being cognitively far more flexible. And it's not just that we have many more people in cognitively demanding professions. The professions have been upgraded. Compare the doctor in 1900, who really had only a few tricks up his sleeve, with a modern general practitioner or specialist with years of scientific training. Compare the banker in 1900, who really just needed a good accountant and to know who was trustworthy in the local community for paying back their mortgage. Well, the merchant bankers who brought the world to their knees may have been morally remiss, but they were cognitively very agile. They went far beyond that 1900 banker. They had to look at computer projections for the housing market. They had to get complicated CO squared in order to bundle debt together. and make debt look as if it were actually a profitable asset. They had to prepare a case to get rating agencies to give it a AAA, though in many cases they had virtually bribed the rating agencies. And they also, of course, had to get people to accept these so-called assets and pay money for them, even though they were highly vulnerable. Or take a farmer today. I take the farm manager of today as very different from the farmer of 1900. So it hasn't just been the spread of cognitively demanding professions, it's also been the upgrading of tasks like lawyer and doctor and what have you that have made demands on our cognitive faculties. But I've talked about education and employment. Some of the habits of mind that we have developed over the 20th century have paid off in unexpected areas. I'm primarily a moral philosopher. I merely have a holiday in psychology, and what interests me in general is moral debate. Now, over the last century, in developed nations like America, moral debate has escalated because we take the hypothetical seriously. And we also take universals seriously and look for logical connections. When I came home in 1955 from university at the time of Martin Luther King, a lot of people came home at that time and started having arguments with their parents and grandparents. My father was born in 1885. And he was mildly racially biased. As an Irishman, he hated the English so much he didn't have much emotion for anyone else. But he did have a sense that black people were inferior. And when we said to our parents and grandparents, how would you feel if tomorrow morning you woke up black? They said, that is the dumbest thing you've ever said. Who have you ever known who woke up in the morning that turned black? In other words, they were fixed in the concrete mores and attitudes they had inherited. They would not take the hypothetical seriously. And without the hypothetical, it's very difficult to get moral argument off the ground. You have to say, you know, imagine you were in Iran, and imagine that your relatives all suffered from collateral damage, even though they had done no wrong. How would you feel about that? And if someone of the older generation says, well, our government takes care of us, and it's up to their government to take care of them, they're just not willing to take the hypothetical seriously. Or take an Islamic father whose daughter has been raped and he feels he's honor-bound to kill her. Well, he's treating his mores as if they were sticks and stones and rocks that he had inherited, and they're unmovable in any way by logic. They're just inherited mores. Today we would say something like, well, imagine you were knocked unconscious and sodomized. Would you deserve to be killed? And he would say, well, that's not in the Quran. You know, that's not one of the principles I've got. Well, you today universalize your principles. You state them as abstractions and you use logic on them. If you have a principle such as people shouldn't suffer unless they're guilty of something, then to exclude black people, you've got to make exceptions, don't you? You have to say, well, blackness of skin, you couldn't suffer just for that. It must be that blacks are somehow tainted. And then we can bring empirical evidence to bear, can't we? And say, well, how can you consider all blacks tainted when St. Augustine was black and Thomas Sowell is black? And you can get moral argument off the ground then, because you're not treating moral principles as concrete entities. You're treating them as universals to be rendered consistent by logic. Now, how did all of this arise out of IQ tests? That's what initially got me going on cognitive history. If you look at the IQ test, you find the gains have been greatest in certain areas. The similarity subtest of the Wechsler is about classification, and we have made enormous gains on that classification subtest. There are other parts of the IQ test battery that are about using logic on abstractions. Some of you may have taken Raven's progressive matrices, and it's all about analogies. And in 1900, people could do simple analogies. That is, if you said to them, cats are like wild cats, what are dogs like? They would say wolves. But by 1960, people could attack ravens on a much more sophisticated level. If you said, we've got two squares followed by a triangle, what follows two circles? They could say a semicircle. Just as a triangle is half of a square, a semicircle is half of a circle. By 2010, college graduates, if you said, two circles followed by a semicircle, two 16s followed by what? They would say 8, because 8 is half of 16. That is, they had moved so far from the concrete world that they could even ignore the appearance of the symbols that were involved in the question. Now, I should say one thing that's very disheartening. We haven't made progress on all fronts. One of the ways in which we would like to deal with the sophistication of the modern world is through politics. And sadly, you can have humane moral principles, you can classify, you can use logic on abstractions, and if you're ignorant of history and of other countries, you can't do politics. We've noticed a trend among young Americans that they read less history and less literature and less material about foreign lands, and they're essentially ahistorical. They live in the bubble of the present. They don't know the Korean War from the war in Vietnam. They don't know who was an ally of America in World War II. Think how different America would be if every American knew that this is the 5th time Western armies have gone to Afghanistan to put its house in order, and if they had some idea of exactly what had happened on those 4 previous occasions. And that is, they had barely left and there wasn't a trace in the sand. Or imagine how different things would be if most Americans knew that we had been lied into 4 of our last 6 wars. You know, the Spanish didn't sink the battleship Maine. The Lusitania was not an innocent vessel but was loaded with munitions. The North Vietnamese did not attack the 7th Fleet. And of course, Saddam Hussein hated Al-Qaeda and yet had nothing to do with it. And yet the administration convinced 45% of the people that they were brothers in arms when he would hang one from the nearest lamppost. But I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. The 20th century has shown enormous cognitive reserves in ordinary people that we have now realized. And the aristocracy was convinced that the average person couldn't make it, that they could never share their mindset or their cognitive abilities. Lord Curzon once said he saw people bathing in the North Sea, and he said, "Why did no one tell me what white bodies the lower orders have?" As if they were a reptile. Well, Dickens was right and he was wrong. Dickens said, "The Colonel's Lady and Judy O'Grady are sisters underneath the skin."
So, what do you think? Do you think you're the one?
Honestly, I don't know.
You know what that means? It's Latin. Means know thyself. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Being the one is just like being in love. No one can tell you you're in love, you just know it. Through and through. Balls to bones. Well, I better have a look at you. Open your mouth, say ah.
Ah.
Okay. Now I'm supposed to say, that's interesting, but then you say.
But what?
But you already know what I'm going to tell you.
I'm not the one.
Sorry, kid. You got the gift, but it looks like you're waiting for something.
Intelligence is a very important psychological variable because it predicts so many things about real life. And this is no surprise. I mean, you know some people who are intelligent and you know some people who are not so intelligent. And for some things, it doesn't really matter. And for other things, it does matter. If you want to go to engineering school, you need a certain level of intelligence to learn that material because that material is complex. So anything that involves complex learning, you need some level of intelligence. The more complex, it doesn't mean you can't learn it if you're not extremely smart. It just takes you longer to get there. Intelligence, so intelligence is important for success at complex jobs, not so important for less complex jobs. And this is kind of an obvious thing. The interesting thing for me is why some people turn out to be more intelligent than others. And many people believe this has to do with their culture and their environment. And this has been the predominant view for decades. And that the feeling is if you take people who are having trouble in school, who have cognitive difficulties, these difficulties come from the fact that their early environments did not stimulate them enough. And so that if you can provide stimulating environments, if you're a new parent, you want your infant to be, your child to be stimulated. In school, you want good teachers, stimulating teachers. But it turns out that the actual research on this doesn't show a clear picture for the role of environment and culture. It doesn't show no effect, but it doesn't show a strong effect. The strongest effect seems to be genetic. And this makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. And I think it makes people uncomfortable for the wrong reason. People believe widely that if something is genetic, it's determined, it's fixed in stone. It's not really accurate to think of genes as deterministic. It's more accurate to think of genes as probabilistic. If you have certain genes, certain combinations of genes, that increases the probability of something. So there's no one gene for intelligence. People who study the genetics of intelligence I believe there's probably around 1,000 genes related to intelligence. Those 1,000 genes don't act independently. They affect each other. So we don't even know the best way to study these kind of genetic interactions. And some of those genes will interact with environmental variables and some won't. There are a lot of combinations, but it's not infinite. And this is what neuroscientists do. You know, they take the nightmare of figuring out genes, and over time, they figure it out one step at a time. And so the reason I'm optimistic about the neuroscience of intelligence is that I think sooner or later, we'll know what the key genes are. We don't have to know all 1,000 necessarily. We'll know what the key ones are. We'll figure out what they do in the brain. And then once we figure out what the genes do, then and how they work, then you can figure out ways to manipulate those genes and the processes with the ultimate goal of increasing intelligence for everybody.
And that is a pretty scary thought.
Now, I've heard that a lot. You explain to me why it would be scary to have more intelligence. Wouldn't that be a good thing?
If it's for everybody, yes.
Why not?
For people that can afford it, I think it's a bad thing. But if it's for everybody, I think it's a good thing.
What is it, Niobe?
I can't help it, Morpheus. I can't help thinking, what if you're wrong? What if all this, the prophecy, everything is bullshit?
Then tomorrow we may all be dead. But how would that be different from any other day?
Some facts covered so far. IQ tests were used by eugenics boards in Canada to justify sterilizing people. People like Glenn Sinclair, whose WISC score at age 15 and a half was borderline but felt to be low. This means low verbal, average or low average perceptual, and borderline total IQ. His mother had also been sterilized. He made his literal escape from the Michener Center under the cover of darkness and never looked back.
What would happen to somebody if they ran away and got caught?
They would put you in a place what they call the quiet room. And you'd be there for about a month. They'd keep you there for about a month. And sometimes in other circumstances, you would get what they call the strap. And you get your bottom and back black and blue with the strap. I think about 20 lashes with the strap. So that's why I was kind of scared never to step out of line. I had to be very careful and mind my P's and Q's.
Its main building, in which he had his 5-minute sterilization interview, was struck by lightning and burned down. From this, we see the reasons for his admission were training and care. And below that, we have the list of terms in no apparent order used to quote-unquote diagnose him. Education, and therefore intelligence, requires freedom, which is something we are seeing less of in our institutions. The more one is different, either by belief or identity, the less one feels at liberty to engage in their own liberal education. School, as a word or concept, has had much less to do with education or the growth of intelligence than we would care to admit. Even in our common usage, to school often means to correct. She schooled him on the issue. Leilani Muir was sterilized right on the grounds of the PTS, the Provincial Training School. First Nations children were sent to residential schools to prevent their learning from their parents. There is another softer way in which school means control. Leilani Muir and Francis Whiskey Chan both called for young people to learn in school what happened to them. The idea behind this is to ensure that students are directed, like a school of fish,
a school of fish. A school of fish.
To better behavior and morals in the future. Note that to say school means control is not to say that school only means control. Our odd tendency to insert only will be dealt with in the complex cognition lecture. Group scores on tests differ. This is the case with IQ, math, problem solving. Thomas Sowell has managed to transcend the century-old nature-nurture IQ debate and point out the implications of the fact that intelligence behaves the same way in any and all groups of humans we measure. There are no special reasons for group differences that should be informing any individual case. An example is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales. If you apply Canadian standards to US scores, they score below average. If you apply US standards to Canadian scores, Canadians score above average. Put more specifically, the same answers could earn you an IQ of 114 by Canadian norms, but an IQ of 121 by US norms. Here's an example of somebody who ran the study with Ontario post-secondary students. Circled are the full-scale IQ scores. If you take the exact same answers to the exact same questions and you apply American norms, American standards, these individuals score an average IQ of 98.4. And if you apply Canadian norms, they score 91.2. Roughly 7 IQ points difference between the two norm sets. Your question of whether you are the one who will get your family its first university or medical degree is not settled by the fact that you are Canadian. It's the least relevant thing. Any issue that a group category might point to is an individual issue. Sowell has a meta-perspective that grouping, by race or otherwise, is part of what is preventing people from thinking helpfully or usefully about intelligence. None of the people I have seen interview him seem to understand him on this point. I think Flynn goes out of his way to mention Sowell by name because Flynn read Sowell, took his meta-perspective seriously, and rediscovered that intelligence lies in the thinking tools that, as the Russian psychologists pointed out, come not from bare brains, but from what each individual puts into her brain and uses.
Put 100 bullets in the bullseye.
This could be described as abstractions begetting better abstractions. This is the knockout blow to those who think that the future of improving intelligence lies in genes. Genes make themselves and replicate themselves. Concepts make better concepts, and these can contain themselves, exponentiating not just intelligence, but our capacity to make more of it. The gene researchers are working on their arm muscles. The rest of us can put catapults in catapults in catapults.
100 bullets in the bullseye.
Note that the lazy tendency here is to revert to nature-nurture nonsense, and at this point it's not helpful. The arm versus catapult analogy is about what would help an individual get better, destroy more of her targets. It's not about, and is far beyond, the time-wasting question of what is more necessary or causal of group differences. It's great that you have a group, but do you have a catapult? If you want one, we have plenty. They don't make life easy, but they certainly make you optimized, or at least much more effective. And the really good news is, if you want to do something other than shoot at targets,
I created the bitch test. They said, oh God, what is the bitch test?
The tools that make up human intelligence help you do that too. Intelligence is the most individuating and empowering factor we have. But it's not one thing, it's several, and you have to pick up all these individual things.
How to conjugate a verb, all about adjectives and adverbs.
If you want to do anything other than the normal, boring target shooting. Okay, I think we can finally just get to some fun facts about intelligence. Let's go. First, education does improve your IQ by somewhere in the range of 1 to 5 IQ points per year. That's not nothing. And fortunately, nobody is reporting that school lowers your IQ. But if you want bad news, stay tuned for next lecture. I'm sure there'll be plenty there to satisfy you. In light of what we just discussed, one would think that the gains would be a lot more for formal schooling. And next lecture we might be able to get a little bit more into why that's not the case. Stuart Ritchie, in his little book titled Intelligence, All That Matters, tells us that the Flynn effect is real. Every year we get 0.3 IQ points smarter as a population. Gains are even greater in developing nations, and score increases are largest on more abstract subtests, like matrix reasoning tasks, described by Flynn, and the similarities subtest, where we have questions like, in what way are time and space alike? Differences in intelligence, the use of conceptual tools to do things, are associated with pretty much everything. If we care about it, intelligence likely predicts something about it or something relevant about our relation to it. Like death. Lower IQ predicts earlier death. Taking the highest IQ nonile as the baseline risk, the lowest IQ nonile has more than 3 times the risk of dying. Some subcomponents of this risk include health behaviors, income, and risk of traffic accidents. Speaking of which, you may be familiar with the Lake Wobegon effect for confidence in one's driving. 90% of drivers think that they're above average drivers. How about intelligence? What percentage of us thinks we're smarter than average? 65%. 65% either mostly agree or strongly agree with the statement, I am more intelligent than the average person. Many things can impact intelligence. Cardiovascular exercise can improve it in the short term or the long term. Concussions can have long-term negative impact, and in the short term, job strain and the sorts of stress that come with providing for others can also negatively impact intelligence and its performance. Big 13-point swings like this are often used as arguments against IQ testing or IQ-adjacent aptitude testing like SAT, MCAT, LSAT, and GRE. While I'm certainly sympathetic to this argument, I think the strongest argument against IQ tests is actually that they tend to explain only 25% of the variation in the outcome variables we care about, such as job performance, as evaluated by performance on technical tasks, i.e. things that one could actually do correctly or incorrectly, and supervisor ratings of general behavior and performance, which admittedly are less objective and more subject to biases like the halo effect. You know, those terrible human biases that make us want to invent a more objective test to reduce prejudice in assessment and judgment, to make sure we aren't just sorting, assigning, promoting, and demoting people based on our feelings, our biased feelings. If only we had a well-established and standardized measure made with that goal in mind, he said, pausing as if to think for a while. Also, well predicted by IQ tests, which profession people end up in. Good luck teaching university, building bridges, or arguing legal cases without good abstracting skills. And higher IQ professions, not surprisingly, tend to be the better paid professions. Here are some typical IQ scores by profession. NASA astronauts would also have a mean of 135, and university physics professors might be the one group that you could count on to reliably have a higher mean than NASA astronauts at around 140. To drive this home a bit, the average IQ of the shortlisted NASA applicants who get rejected is 131. And to show that this goes both ways, it's perfectly legal and normal practice to reject police applicants who score high on intelligence tests. The police service involved in this case had cutoffs equivalent to an IQ of around 114, which would preclude a lot of people who know what preclude means, certainly a good portion of my students. The cutoff approach is likely where IQ tests and the aptitude tests that attempt to copy them do their most effective work. The 4-point difference between NASA applicants with 131 versus 135 IQ is likely not as noteworthy as whatever value NASA would say one needs simply to be considered as an applicant. The usefulness of the IQ test is going to depend on how complex the tasks are, how much independent thinking is required, and how much things can be routinized or learned as patterns. More complexity would recommend more intelligence. Here we can bring in a few key ideas in intelligence research. First, more things determine one's mental abilities than intelligence. More things determine one's intelligence than IQ. More things determine one's IQ than G, but G is at the core of each of these things, determining the ease with which one accomplishes tasks and puts together an understanding of their complex world. If you don't think G is important, say most intelligence researchers, then you aren't seeing enough of the world. You aren't seeing how hard life is for someone who can't write a resume or read a bus schedule, follow instructions for how to get government documents, file taxes, compute a budget, communicate their circumstances to others, learn new required technologies, and the list goes on. Those with higher IQ take it for granted. So, is G intelligence? No, G is the statistical result whenever we correlate performance measures on tasks that require intelligence. Taking an example from Flynn, most of us know someone with quite a lot of musical talent who can ear her way through different songs on different instruments, find notes and key signatures, and identify and recall melodies. This person would have musical G, a general ability in music that makes her good at different musical things. G, the general intelligence factor, is that for anything involving abstraction or mental ability. And just to confuse you a bit, there are two models for how G operates or is structured. The first is modeled after Jensen's original idea. and the method by which the statistical G was derived. In other words, G is the correlation of other, slightly more specific but also general abilities. Let's call them mid-abilities, like verbal ability, spatial conceptualizing ability, processing speed, etc. G feeds or determines these mid-abilities, which determine much more specific skills and performance that we actually observe and care about. The second G model, which tends to better fit both the data and the way we end up talking about G, is called the bi-factor model, and it conceptualizes G as making you better at these more specific skills and performances, while the mid-abilities contribute independently of G to these more specific skills. Hence the name bi-factor. Any given things in this middle row of specific observable abilities that we actually care about is being determined by two separate factors. Either way, G is there determining how much work it is for you to succeed in tasks requiring mental work. Getting back to the more concrete. In Canada, our armed forces have a cutoff on the CFAT equivalent to an IQ of 94. In times of war, the cutoffs can be lowered and the training requirements changed accordingly, but in general, there's an acknowledgement that soldiers, even of the lowest rank and responsibility level, have to be capable of problem solving, recalling procedures, following multi-step instructions, parsing commands or tasks, and acting in terms of an end goal to be reached, not just an explicit and immediate step-by-step style that has been specified for you. Note that this is in general. As my grandmother, who was a tailor in the Air Force, would likely say, somebody has to peel the potatoes. The U.S. military's standard IQ cutoff has been around 92 in times of relative peace. There are two notable occasions where the cutoff was abandoned. The first was Robert McNamara's Project 100,000 for the Vietnam War. The draft was being protested and he needed soldiers. There were plenty of volunteers who had not met the cutoff, so he lowered standards and sent recruiters after this new pool of potential volunteers. Changing the cutoffs also opened up a larger pool of draftees, especially in the neighborhoods where people were less likely to mobilize politically against the draft, or have the savvy and the resources to muster good excuses, or hightail it north to Canada. McNamara attempted to sell his lowering of standards as presenting an opportunity for the Project 100,000 recruits to be instructed by the military, after which they will surely be more employable in the real world. The military will use educational video to raise their intelligence. So, how did things work out? Firstly, attrition rates tended to be twice or 3 times as high for the Project 100,000 recruits. Nearly 10% of them ended up failing out, compared with the usual 3%. So they wasted a lot of people's time, but those numbers aren't too bad. Second, Project 100,000 recruits had higher rates of going AWOL, absent without leave, and making critical errors both in training and in the jungles of Vietnam. This led to a roughly doubled risk of mortality for Project 100,000 recruits and an increase in risk for their unit members as well. These results had been anticipated by legal standards, and one GI counselor, David Robinson, who characterizes the recruitment of some individuals with IQs 2 standard deviations below the mean as, quote, a crime against the mentally disabled, end quote. The predictable causes of injuries included unsafe use of firearms and grenade, getting lost in the jungle, and one case of friendly fire precipitated by poor memory. The soldier had been tasked with standing watch, and approaching friendlies were supposed to state, if asked, a given password. The Project 100,000 soldier asked the approaching person to state the password. The approaching person stated the correct password, but the Project 100,000 soldier could not remember what the correct password actually was, so he shot the approaching soldier. Finally, these are the career trajectory outcomes for that group compared to a control of recruits who did meet the cutoff. Project 100,000 recruits did not advance as well through the ranks as the others in their cohort, and I will leave to your imagination whether or not the videotape-enhanced military training they received made them more employable after they returned home. Also on this chart are the results of a recruitment error that let in applicants below cutoff in 1983. Note that they similarly lagged somewhat behind standard meeting recruits of the same 1983 cohort. There were, of course, success stories. Soldiers who made the most of themselves, in part because they were given a chance. And it is all too easy to conflate the wrongness of the war with the wrongness of a policy, but people died in disproportionate numbers because congressional laws put in place to protect them were not followed. Ignoring intelligence test cutoffs cost people their lives. There's more I wanted to cover here, but I'm way over time, and I might pick up some of it in the next lecture. Stay tuned.